Hey everyone, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really specific, kind of complex geopolitical worldview. We're going to break down the framework presented by political organizer Susan Kokinda in a recent interview. Now, whether you just follow politics casually or you're a total political junkie, getting a grip on the deep, underlying theories driving these movements is absolutely essential. To be clear, we aren't here to endorse these views or take sides. We're just going to impartially map out the architecture of this theory straight from the source material.
So, to wrap our heads around this, we're going to hit 5 main beats today. The two-system theory, rebuilding the working class, Canada, and economic sovereignty, a pretty unique critique of environmentalism, and finally, Trump as the disruptor.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the two-systems theory. This is basically the bedrock of the entire worldview. It argues that modern politics isn't just left versus right, it's actually a historical clash between two totally opposite systems. The source draws a super sharp line in the sand here. On one side, you've got what they call the British imperial system. According to the interview, this system is equated with modern globalism. Think central banking, zero growth policies, and basically treating people like cogs in a machine just to extract wealth. On the complete flip side is the American system. Rooted in Alexander Hamilton's ideas, this model champions economic sovereignty. It's all about physical manufacturing, bringing supply chains home, and measuring the economy by whether people are actually working good-paying, single-income family jobs.
Now, as you might guess, changing from one system to the other, not a quick fix. Kokinda actually uses a quote from J.D. Vance to capture just how massive this undertaking is. It's literally like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around. The source argues that the American system has been written out of history for over a century, so reversing course now means fighting a massive, multi-generational current.
Moving on to Section 2, rebuilding the working class. Let's see how this high-level geopolitical theory actually hits the ground for the everyday American worker.
The source lays out a very deliberate timeline of deindustrialization. Think about Detroit in the 1960s. Blue-collar workers there had the highest per capita standard of living in the country. The speaker argues that success wasn't an accident, and neither was its collapse. They point to 1971, when the U.S. ditched the gold standard to print fiat money as the beginning of the end. And then, boom, the 1990s NAFTA agreement was the killer blow. The core argument here is that these weren't just market forces. They were specific, globalist policy choices that systematically gutted the middle class and turned tangible production into just another profit stream for the elite.
Which leads us to this fascinating concept, compensating the loser. The speaker leans on this quote from investor Scott Bessent to make a crucial point. From this viewpoint, instead of empowering citizens to be producers who control their own destinies, the system just pacifies them with handouts. It intentionally turns everyday citizens into economic losers who have to rely on the system to survive.
But are workers buying into that? To argue that they aren't, the speaker drops a pretty wild stat from their own 2023 organizational data. They found that 60% of auto workers out on picket lines supported a nationalist economic approach. 60%! And get this, the source emphasizes that this figure held true across totally different racial and geographic demographics. Why? Because according to this theory, these workers see themselves as producers living in the real world, first and foremost.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, Canada and economic sovereignty. We're looking across the border now to see how this framework views international relations. So, zooming out a bit, you really have to wonder, where does a massive, resource-heavy trading partner like Canada actually fit into this giant tug-of-war between globalism and national sovereignty?
Well, the source points straight at figures like Mark Carney. He famously headed up both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. In this worldview, Carney represents a deliberate push to maintain that old imperial rules-based order. The speaker views his efforts as basically packaging the same old free trade policies into a shiny new globalism 2.0 to fight back against the wave of nationalist disruption.
To give this some historical flavor, the speaker brings up a really interesting anecdote from a Chatham House seminar. They discussed U.S. President William McKinley's tariffs back in the late 19th century. The point being made is that the British Empire has always been terrified that aggressive U.S. economic policies might force Canada to step away from being an imperial outpost and push it toward total economic sovereignty, or even closer integration with the U.S.
Fast forward to today, and this isn't just ancient history. The source argues this exact struggle is playing out regionally right now. Specifically, look at resource-rich provinces like Alberta. They've got massive untapped wealth and have even explored political referendums. According to the speaker, globalist elites are going to fight that tooth and nail
because there is absolutely no way they let that kind of wealth slip out of their controlled system.
Okay, Section 4, the critique of environmentalism. Now, this brings us to a core and definitely controversial tenet of this worldview. The speaker basically frames modern environmentalism as a tool for social control, what they call ideological infiltration. Rather than seeing it as ecological protection, this framework asserts it's a top-down strategy to manage populations. They trace the roots all the way back to 19th century Malthusian ideas, the whole theory that population growth will inevitably outpace the food supply. The argument here is that this mindset falsely treats human beings as if we're just mere animals.
So Kokinda contrasts this fixed carrying capacity idea directly with human creativity. Think about it. A herd of animals might just starve if they eat all the grass in a field, right? But humans? The source argues we are totally different. We constantly redefine our carrying capacity through creative breakthroughs, from discovering fire to inventing modern farming to harnessing nuclear power.
And the ultimate point here is about the real world. Working-class producers, farmers, tradespeople live in physical reality, where bad ideas have immediate consequences. The source points out that you can hold whatever top-down opinion you want, but if your opinion is that you can successfully plant crops in December, well, the real world is going to punish you for that mistake instantly.
Finally, Section 5, Trump as the disruptor. Let's see how this worldview justifies some pretty extreme, controversial political behavior as a calculated tactic against institutional power.
Kokinda argues that when you're up against an entrenched system managed by enforced cultural madness, you absolutely need a blunt disruptor. They talk about small group dynamics, where people are terrified of being canceled or ostracized by their peers. To shatter that kind of social mind control, the source says a leader has to act like a bull in a china shop. By refusing to play by polite rules and doing outrageous things, it gives everyday citizens permission to finally think freely.
They use a really specific example to illustrate this. Donald Trump sending a highly inflammatory message to Iran. A lot of critics just saw chaos, but the source claims this was actually a hyper-deliberate strategic move. By dropping an outrageous message on a holy day like Easter Sunday, the disruptor proves to foreign adversaries that he literally cannot be manipulated by domestic political outrage or bad press.
This whole disruptor approach applies internationally too. Instead of traditional regime change, dragging one leader out, installing a puppet, and destabilizing the whole country, this theory pushes for a targeted strategy. Using examples like Venezuela or Iran, the speaker argues the goal is to target key nodes of corruption, starve the regimes, and allow the society to evolve internally, rather than bombing it into the Stone Age.
So, what is the whole shebang leading up to?
To summarize the source's philosophy, the endgame isn't just passing a few local policies or winning a single election cycle. The stated goal is completely dismantling that overarching imperial system of global finance and replacing it with a sovereign, production-based society that actually prioritizes the working class. Which leaves us with a massive, provocative question to chew on. As this push for national economic sovereignty keeps colliding head-on with established global financial structures, what will the fallout look like? What does this mean for the working class, for our international borders, and for the entire future of North America? Thank you so much for walking through this structural explainer with me today. Keep asking those hard questions, and we'll see you next time.